We are going to have a hearing where our executive director of PERS will give an update and answer some questions, and hopefully it'll help provide a little insight into some of the issues that we've been dealing with, and it'll help the committee members also just get an update from PERS. And so look forward to Director Higgins' testimony. I appreciate y'all being here today, and it's kind of short notice. We played around with the dates, but I appreciate y'all accommodating us and making your way over here. So, Director Higgins, you're recognized to speak.
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's always good to visit with you, and we appreciate the chance to talk with you this morning. Before I get started, let me just mention I do have several members of the PERS team here with me today. I want to mention at least two. We have Mr. Bill Benson, who is the current chairman of the PERS board. He's also the longest serving active member on the board and is the Chancery clerk in Lee County. And today we also have Mr. Ed Coble, who is our consulting actuary with Cavanaugh McDonald, sometimes referred to as CAVMAC. He's also the CEO of the company. So glad to have them. And like I said, we have several other members of the PERS team. Up front here, we have our chief investment officer as well. So several members of the PERS team that may be able to help should we have questions or need to do that at any time. So again, thank you for having me. As far as PERS, we have about $38 billion in the portfolio as of now, as of this morning. Last year, we had a good investment return last fiscal year, which was approximately 11.7%. We're off to a good start this fiscal year, and we certainly hope that continues. And our overall funded ratio is approximately 57%. Now, as far as the general update, I'd like to refer you to the blue packet, the blue notebook, blue folder, if you will, that you have in front of you. There's a lot of good information in there. It's an update of some of our regular annual publications. So a lot of good info in there, and would be happy to speak to some of that information if you like later, but just would encourage you to review that at your convenience. And today, rather than more along the lines of the general update, I would like to use the time to talk to some of the key topics or hot topics as it pertains to PERS this year. And as you know, there's a lot of activity for PERS this year and a lot more perhaps than usual early in session. So I want to speak to a few of those key topics, and the first one being funding. Funding of existing PERS is certainly the current priority, and funding is most important. So I want to thank you very much for the funding bill there, the first day of session. That's very exciting to see such a large some activity like that, the $1 billion funding bill, the first day of session and coming out of the Senate, the first week of session. Of course, the House has seemed to indicate support for funding as well, but just really want to thank you. Want to thank Senator Sparks and Chairman Sparks, but also the other two chairmen, Chairman Harkins and Chairman Hobson, I believe, that were authors of the bill, and really all of you. It's good to see the focus on funding. It's good to see such a serious effort or serious step or commitment toward beginning to address the unfunded status. So thank you for that. I wish I could pause there for a little bit, but I would be remiss if I didn't relay that the board has recommended a funding level based on the determination of the actuaries of approximately 26% of payroll, and we're currently at 18.4% of payroll. So I encourage you to continue to focus on funding. And I also want to explain that gap and encourage you to use that as a backdrop for some of the things and some of the proposals that you all are considering this session, or that I believe you will be considering this session. And I want to speak to three of them, being return to work, first responders, and Tier 5. As it relates to return to work, it certainly can be done. You just have to change the law and be mindful of the funding. There's just a few key areas. Consider the policy, which of course you can as the policy makers. Change the law, which of course you can as the lawmakers. We appreciate you all working with us to make sure we comply with federal requirements, but just please be mindful of any funding implications. Now, this one has more moving parts than some of the others, but we're happy to work with you on that, and we'll be able to provide estimates at the right time. The next one, next topic I mentioned was first responders. Let me say first, I certainly appreciate first responders, as I'm sure many of you do. I support them personally and professionally, including helping maintain their existing promised benefit. But we do ask that as you're considering things with that, certainly be mindful of the funding. Now, on some of the proposals that I've heard or read about in first responders, it certainly can be done. But once again, change the law, and then we need to make sure that it's funded. And the way we would recommend that it be done, if it's to be considered, is to do it within PERS, not a separate system, but do it within PERS. Identify the people, identify the parameters. For example, one would have to work 30 years instead of 35. Let's cost it out and then just make sure somebody pays for it. Now, whether that's the state or the employers at the local level or the employee, it could, or a combination. We just need to make sure somebody pays for it. Now, just to remind you, you may recall a couple years ago, the largest outcry about funding concerns when the rate was increased did come from local government. So just please keep that in mind. That's something else for you to maybe consider. But the key thing is just that somebody provide the funding. Last area I mentioned was Tier 5, referring to the Tier 5 hybrid that was passed last year. We're moving full speed toward implementation, currently on track for March 1st. And on that topic, I would encourage you to stay the course, or for all intents and purposes, stay the course. But with that said, it is, and I suspect it will remain the state's responsibility for plan design. As the sponsor, as the settler, you all design the benefits in law, and we administer the benefit after they're designed. So that's certainly your prerogative, but we would just say, keep in mind that at this point, since Tier 5 is the law, any changes could potentially be a step back financially, modified Tier 5. So we just, on any of those things that you're looking at, we would just request and recommend strongly that you consider the potential cost implications or possibly additional cost being placed on already a system that's underfunded. In this case, what I mean, there's the funded ratio of approximately 57%. There's certainly that, and we all would be more comfortable if that were higher. But there's the gap between what the board has recommended and the actuaries have determined as far as the annual funding we need versus what is currently coming in. So we just request you be mindful of the potential cost implications for any of the initiatives that you're considering and ensure that they're funded. A little later in session, we hope to be back before you with some of the PERS requested legislation. We have 3 bills. They shouldn't really be of too much concern, hopefully. And I think this committee has actually seen them before, but today's more of a general update. And as I close, I'll just say funding of current PERS is certainly the priority. So I thank you again for the emphasis on that in the funding bill, and would be happy to pause and try to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. Again, what is the total assets controlled by?
Approximately 38 billion.
38?
38 billion as of this morning. Now, some of the information in your report and the notebook is as of last fiscal year end, so it could be different, but approximately 38 billion in the portfolio as of this morning.
So the 36.03 was from June 30 of 25?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you said that the last year's return was 11.66%.
That's correct.
And over a 30-year average, we're averaging 7.95.
That's correct.
Okay. The funding, one of the things that I've heard you discuss in the past is this number that was picked, I guess it was 8-10 years ago, on the funding ratio. Or do y'all amortized it? Y'all set a date out 30 years. Was that?
Yes, I think what you're referring to is back around 2016 or 2017 or so when a new funding policy was adopted and we moved to a different amortization method, referring to some closed amortization for the ADEC calculation was 2047, which at that time was 30 years from when it was being done. That's probably what you're referring to.
Yeah. Are y'all going to update that, or do y'all move that? Do y'all do one every 5 years, 10 years, 2 years? Do you update? Is it a moving scale, or are we still operating on a number that's now 20 years out?
Well, we definitely look at it, and we look at it regularly because it's part of the board's funding policy, which is reviewed often, but certainly annually. And happy to look at that again. What I will say is part of the reasons, even though a lot of that was before my tenure, is the reason that was chosen was it was more in line with to have a closed amortization period at only 30 years was more in line with the actuarial standards of practice at the time. Of course, they've actually tightened a little more in the several years since then. but it's certainly something we can look at. Now, you want to be careful of looking at it too often or changing it too often, because otherwise you negate some of the progress you could make. Because part of the reason to have the closed amortization is to make a better effort at paying off the unfunded liability as opposed to essentially refinancing each year. So you have to be careful with that. Now, with that in mind, I've already stated that I think if we were to have a large change in funding, that maybe that's something that we should review and could look at. I don't know how that will unfold. I certainly could say we'll review it. I'm not sure exactly what we'd recommend or exactly how the actuaries would feel about it or exactly how the board would act on it. But personally, I do think that should a large influx of funding or a significant change in funding come, I do think that's something that we could look at and review, because there has been you have to be very careful with it. And I could elaborate more on that when the time comes, because it's fiduciaries. We got to make sure and do what's best for PERS. And I know you all want what's best for the system as well. But there has been several big things happen. We've had an increase in the employer rate. We've had some appropriations. It looks like there's potentially another large, significant funding commitment coming. There's been pension reform. So it does seem logical to me that with all of those things together, should major funding come through, perhaps we could look at that, consider that, and recalibrate it, if you will. We'll just have to see what the current standards of practice yield. But that's a long way of saying about happy to look at it.
Well, I'm not an actuary, but I think that if you picked a date 30 years out and you've taken a snapshot of it, if you don't, I don't know why you wouldn't want to revisit that. Because if you're operating under that same mantra of where the snapshot of the picture was 10 years ago, what is it? I mean, factors change, returns change. I mean, obviously we've made changes on paper with the assumed rate of return going down, but the other factors that have changed since that date, does it not warrant just a fresh set of eyes looking at a new snapshot of a new 30-year? I mean, why would you not want to take, every 5 years, take a new 30-year snapshot? Not that you would change anything, but at least you would know how the environment has changed as it relates to the performance of your asset. Would that not, I mean, I'm not a charter financial analyst. To me, it looks like you would take another look at what your circumstances are. And then, if you don't change anything, if you're saying you don't want to change anything because of, if you set funding requirements or you set funding patterns out based on that number and then you go and change them, well, yeah, that's going to have an impact on it. But if we're getting better, at least we'd like to know if it's improving, I guess. And I feel like some of the talk you hear is everything is based on that snapshot, and it doesn't take into consideration anything that's been done or any changes that have been made. We put $100 million, $110 million in the system. We've got another funding tranche this year. We've increased the employer rate, and we're increasing it year over year for the next few years. So those factors, to me, it doesn't seem like they're getting any traction or any acknowledgement in the fact that you're still looking at that 30-year snapshot from 10 years ago.
Well, like I said, certainly happy to look at that, but just to share with you, I think a lot of the things you called out, we definitely are looking at and factoring in. For example, in the latest valuation and projection report, it includes the $110 million from a few years ago. It includes the Tier 5 pension reform. It includes the scheduled phased-in employer increase. So all those things are definitely factored in. And we also take a different snapshot each year. We do an annual valuation that does that each year along with the projection. And then we also do what we call an experience investigation or an experience study, where every 2 years on a rolling 4-year basis, we look at all the assumptions and compare them to what actually happened and adjust as needed. So I definitely don't want to leave any misunderstanding there. We're certainly factoring that in, certainly looking at it. I was only referring to the amortization period and approach for the calculation of the ADEC. The one thing, though, you have to be careful of, because I think it's actually part of what has let some states, including perhaps us, the unfunded grow. If you don't have some kind of closed amortization period approach and you're essentially refinancing each year, then you're not making progress toward paying off that unfunded. So that's part of the reason to be careful of that. But we definitely look at all those things and have those factored in.
I see the first bullet in your overview of PERS says we rank 71st by assets among 1,000 largest U.S. retirement funds.
Yes, sir. That sounds right according to that publication of the last time it was printed.
What rank does that mean? Is that,
That just gives some context of the size relative to other pension funds. There's nothing.
is it performance? Is it, what is it ranking?
That was based on asset size, I believe.
Asset size, okay. Um,
Oh, yeah, definitely not performance. That's just, I think.
well, I just want to make sure when I'm reading, I
Oh,
don't
yeah, sure.
draw any conclusions. Um, one of the things that we talked about, I think when the PERS board recommended or gave a nod to the tier 5 was that it had to have a positive impact on the liabilities, the unfunded liabilities. Does the tier 5 has a positive impact on unfunded liabilities, does it not?
Yes, sir. I believe that it does. It does. And now it's long-term. It's going to take time.
Oh, yeah.
But it was estimated and projected at that time to essentially do what was captured in the board's motion, but to reduce future liabilities, help mitigate risk, help pay off the unfunded liability sooner, help direct more money toward paying off the unfunded. So in short, yes, sir, to help positively contribute to the financial status.
And tier 5 does that?
Yes, sir. That's what we project and estimate. Long term, we still need funding, but yes, sir.
All right. And I heard you talking during your remarks about first responders. You said that there should only be one system. You shouldn't expand on that.
Sure, that would be our recommendation for PERS of Mississippi. Of course, my role certainly, and the team's role and the board's role as fiduciaries toward the existing system and membership. But we would recommend that, especially in a system like Mississippi and our PERS and a state like Mississippi, referring mainly to the funded status. But we think it can be best done within PERS. But the two things to be mindful of when you're talking about a separate system or a standalone system, you have to be mindful of what impact does that have on current PERS with removing members from that and therefore removing the contributions that would come for that. So that's one of the main reasons there, especially with our approximately 57% funded status. It may or may not be a large impact, but it's certainly something to calculate and be mindful of. The other thing, depending upon how the new system is created and what type of liabilities there are or transfers or so forth, is you could potentially start the hypothetical new system off with an unfunded liability. So those are just two reasons we recommend it'd be best within here. I'll add to that, and this was some of the board meeting commentary at the time. There could also be concerns about having different systems and then what group might be next. And then you have different systems competing for a finite amount of resources. So that's some additional concern, but it also depends on the design.
Okay. I'll open it up to the floor for questions. Senator Sparks for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Higgins. We didn't, I don't recall, maybe I missed it, go through the numbers of returns. This year, the percentage return on the assets was what number?
Approximately 11.7%.
And last year, the returns were approximately what number?
Approximately 11%. I want to say 10.66, but I could be wrong, but I think roughly 11% though.
So we've averaged, no, I don't want to use the word average because every year is different, but 11.7, and then I thought I remembered 10.34. I could be wrong.
That
on
could be.
But north of 10% and then north of 11% the last 2 years. And the funding policy that you referenced and the chairman asked you about includes an assumed rate of return, correct?
That's right.
And that's how they calculate future liabilities is based on that assumed rate of return.
Yes, sir.
And what is that current assumed annual rate of return?
7%.
And is it not correct that that rate was 7.75% in 2021, 2022, and through actions of the funding policy and the board over a 3-year period, they lowered the assumed rate of return from 7.75 to the current 7.
That's correct.
All right. As I think we've discussed it prior in calculations, every quarter point inflated the liabilities by about $2 billion. Is that correct?
It seems about right from history. I wouldn't necessarily use the word inflated, but I understand that.
Well, what word would you use if it went up?
Well, I just think, I mean, I see, I don't want to interrupt your train of thought or your question, but It's just important to have a reasonable and appropriate assumed rate, because otherwise, if you don't, you understate the liabilities and risk underfunding the plan. So that's why.
And I appreciate that, but we're talking about math right now.
Yeah.
Not policy, not actuarial, national, global, standards. We're talking about the decision that was made by the board to lower the assumed rate of return from 7.75 to 7% over the last 6 years, 4 years. Did that not increase the unfunded liability by approximately $6 billion on paper?
It definitely increased, and I like the word increase. It did increase the liability. Now, it was one of the main contributors toward increasing the liability. It wasn't the only one, but certainly a main one, and that math sounds about right.
Okay. And the reason I say that is you referenced actuarial funding recommendations from the actuary, Kavanaugh McDonald. And that there is an actuarial determined contribution, and that's 25.92, I think maybe was what the recent ask was. The reason I asked that is because, I received text message this morning, and I received a lot of text messages about Tier 5 and PERS. And this one was very nice, very succinct. It congratulated me on the arrival of the new baby in the last couple of days, and then said, today's a great day to end Tier 5 and fund PERS. That's the importance of this to people, but the math matters. The actuarial funding recommendation from the actuaries is passed along to the legislature when the PERS board adopts that. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. And anything less that this legislature does gets promoted as we're underfunding PERS.
It could.
It does. So this year, that number was $453 million. Now, I want to go back to the chairman's question. In 2017, the actuaries who don't put any money in this system decided, and I got the report right here, June 30, 2017, decided to recommend to the board to close the amortization, layered amortization. Did that increase the unfunded liability by closing amortization? That drive the number up for future.
I don't know that it would increase the unfunded liability, but it would have an impact on the ADEC, on the contribution.
So the recommendations that come for the next 10 years are higher because we closed the amortization.
Yes, sir.
All right. And because the legislature, and I maybe ask this in form of a question, did the legislature take any action from June 30, 2017, when you presented this report, by infusing money or changing the rate until what we did in 2024?
That predates me a little bit, but I think the answer is no up until 2024.
Okay. So this legislature, from 2017 until what we've done in this current legislature, who has put $110 million into the system, has raised the employer rate 2.5%, which will be $186 million annually when it's fully implemented. Reformed ORP, which will be $3 to $5 million annually, growing by $3 to $5 million annually, going to pay off the UAL, and brought forward reform in the form of Tier 5, which, if I remember correctly, pays 1.89% more of payroll to pay off the UAL. Is that correct?
That's correct. It of course will grow that way slowly, but yes, sir, that's right.
All right. And then the $1 billion that we've passed on day 1 and 2 of this
Sure.
session.
Yeah.
So the concern I have, and I think it goes back to the chairman's question, we have not reviewed the funding policy. I know you review it, excuse me. We've not changed this in spite of the fact, and I understand you didn't change it from 2017, 18, 19, 20, 21, because the legislature didn't do anything. So all these people that have all these solutions today on social media that used to serve in this body didn't bring forward anything. But now that we've done, and I think you called them major changes, infusion of money, new tier, reforms to ORP, ending slurp, by the way, doesn't that warrant looking at adopting a new funding policy?
I think it definitely warrants on, and maybe not the funding policy overall, but the time period associated with the ADEC, as I've mentioned, I think that's something, should a significant large funding come through, like the $1 billion bill, I think that's something that I would recommend that we consider and look at. One little housekeeping note before I forget it, it doesn't change your main points, but some part, if we go back to the early time frame around 2017, 2018, I think with the adoption of that funding policy, I believe there was one employer rate increase. I think it went from 15.75 to 17.4, but that would have been a previous legislature. I forgot to mention that earlier, so I want to get that. But to the other part, yeah, I think that's something we can look at. Again, I don't know what the outcome will be on that, but with the major changes and with a large influx of funding, I think that's something that we could review.
Because the recommendation from the actuaries for funding that is presented to the board, that the board typically passes along, that will continue to go up because of inaction those first 6 or 7 years. They didn't do anything. So the ADEC is going to climb because we're closed to 2047. I didn't understand why you used 2047 the first time you ever came and presented when I was a member of this body in 2020. But they chose a 30-year period. The board chose a 30-year period. And I do think it would be a fairer representation of what this legislature's duty is to, quote, fund PERS, because that's what the text messages always say, fund PERS. When you are taking a number that since the 2017 report has been grossly impacted by lowering the assumed rate of return by 3/4 of a point, $6 billion. That drives the ADEC up, does it not?
It does.
Okay. So that's not a fair ADEC to this legislature. It may be an actuarially sound measure. How long has CAVMAC been our consultant?
For many years, I don't know the exact amount, but for many years, 20 years,
Okay.
years. And speaking of that, in just a moment, if you like, one on the amortization, we have the 2047, the 30-year we're talking about. But when that was adopted, the unfunded at that time was a 30-year amortization. And then we had layered amortization, which means for future gains and losses will be at 25 years. And in a moment, if you like, we can have Mr. Coble come up and talk to that a little bit, and perhaps maybe the views on how it's, even as far as the actuarial standards of practice, have tightened a little bit to shorter timeframes. And at some point, I may want to provide a little background for the committee on the 7% assumption.
And look, I appreciate that. And we've had those discussions here and the reasons and all of that. I'm talking about math today. The changes made by the actuaries that were recommended to the board, that the board made, have increased the unfunded liability. They've driven down the funded percentage below 60%. This is just factual. This is math, and math is nonpartisan and math is undefeated. So the reason I ask that is I hate when I talk to my constituents who say fund PERS. They're probably not going to sit down and have a 45-minute conversation about layered amortization, which is a complex matter. I just want to echo what I believe the chairman said. With all the changes, legislature changes, actuarial changes, that it's not really fair to stick to a number from 2017. And the other thing about the ADEC is there's 20+ assumptions that they review annually. And they can move the goalpost, if you will, on what the funded percentage is by changing an assumption. I recall at a recent meeting, they changed the mortality assumption. That's a reasonable thing to change because people are living longer. That was a $1.65 billion hit to the liabilities. So that was actuarially sound. They presented it to the board agreed to it, and magically, on paper, we were 1.65 billion higher liabilities. Now, other assumptions actually cancel that out. So there's multiple assumptions. But at the end of the day, 100% funding was the policy adopted by the board to be accomplished in 30 years. And that's what's driving this gap of requested funding versus actual funding. Is that fair?
That's certainly part of it. And of course, it's very important to have good assumptions. And one thing now, I remember now I wanted to mention in some of your earlier comments, and you touched on it, but it had to do with things are costing more now because maybe funding or things weren't addressed earlier. I definitely want to emphasize this. The sooner that the funding is provided, the better, because as things go on, it just gets harder and just costs more. So that's for sure.
And then one thing I will touch on, and then I will stop. I don't apologize, but this is an area that I've spent a lot of time on. And I want to make sure the messages that go out, and I appreciate the Senate broadcasting, archiving, recording their hearings, so you can direct your constituents to hear this conversation directly from the director. You can also direct them now to watch PERS board meetings, because they're also streamed, recorded, and archived, because we have a lot of in-depth discussion about these very matters that's hard to take up in a committee meeting. But when you talk about the plan sponsor, we are, as a state, the plan sponsor. The board has a fiduciary duty to current members. That's employees and retirees. And Tier 5, the requirement was it paid the liability faster. That's not the fancy way it was said. It said it would have a positive impact on paying down the, unfunded accumulated actuarial liability. But there's been transmissions of information that says Tier 5 actually increases the liability. Is that true or false?
I don't think that's correct. I think
Okay.
it was, yeah.
So I think people, to a great degree, if they don't understand it and they say something, that's one thing. If they're just misleading because they don't like something, I take a little issue with that. The other piece of this is the net pension liability, the 25 billion roughly. It does not belong to the state of Mississippi. There's a schedule that is on the PERS website that lists the portion of debt every employer has, from my little town of Belmont. And by the way, their amount's $3 million, and we ain't got $3 million to settle the books. My friend Jeremy England sitting up here, I think Ocean Springs area, $28 million. I'll be glad to leave this here. Everybody can look at what your local unit of government, their share of the unfunded liability. So the $1 billion that this legislature is putting in, and the $110 million, is actually paying down the liability of local units of government, because everybody's little account's not separate. All the money's in one pot, correct?
We're definitely all in together. There is that proportionate share of every employer's net pension liability according to the accounting standards.
Okay. And if I remember correctly, as far as percentage share of PERS employees, it's about 50% are in K-12 education.
I want to say it's more like 40, 42, but that's definitely the largest percentage.
And then cities and counties have about 21%.
Sounds right.
Okay. So I think that's an important document for everybody to look at, because one of the reasons that we looked at Tier 5 reform is not because we were bored and wanted to do something. The board had asked for a Tier 5 for at least 2 years.
That's right. They'd recommended one the year before.
All right. And the actuaries recommended it.
Yes, it was based on the actuarial review and consultation.
All right. And if we didn't get the funded liability under control, it affects not only the state's ability to borrow bonding, it affects every one of these individual units of government that need to go borrow, because this number that's in this report is required to be on their financial statements as a liability under governmental accounting standards. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I want to thank you for your work. And by the way, I assume you're prepared for March 1st, the team at PERS.
Yes, sir. We're moving forward and currently on schedule and looking forward to that, and really appreciate the team's effort on doing that.
And I want to say thank you to you, Devetta, and all the team, because I know y'all put in a lot of hours to try to make this happen. And the whole goal of any of this is to stabilize the PERS system.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank
for
you,
your
Mr.
kind
Chairman.
words.
Thank you, Senator Sparks. Senator Brumfield? You have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I have a question. Thank you, Mr. Director, for all of your work. I heard us say something about 11.6% return last year, roughly,
Yes, sir.
in that vicinity. I was looking at the S&P 500, and over the past year, it's been up like 17 to 18%. Tickers like NVIDIA has been up like 39 to 43%. Tickers like Netflix and things of that nature has been up like 38 to 50%. And I'm wondering, how do we go about choosing our tickers or our investment to ensure that we're listening from the Oval Office and hearing what's out there when we talk about tariffs, when we talk about the oil, Venezuela, when we talk about things of that nature. I think ExxonMobil has gone up and paid over 12.9 billion in dividends. And I'm wondering, what are we doing and why are we missing the bulk of this money, or what formulas are we using? Are we staying abreast with what's happening in 2025 and projected 2026? And I'm wondering, how are we going about choosing those tickers and staying involved? Even AMD, Google, they're up at this alarming rate. So I'm just want gold and silver, and we're only 11%. I'm wondering, what formulas are we using to ensure that we're maximizing our return? Can you help us with that?
Sure. Well, certainly appreciate the question and understand, appreciate where you're coming from. Now, one thing to keep in mind is, and also too, it may be difficult to discuss or summarize in a short answer all the work, effort, and analysis that goes into the whole overall management of the PERS portfolio. But with that said, we own probably most, if not all, of those companies that you mentioned. But what you got to remember about the S&P 500 is that is all equities, of course. There's much more volatility. So from the PERS standpoint, we've got to maintain a diversified portfolio to make sure that we can achieve the returns and be able to not only achieve capital appreciation and growth to meet our liabilities, but also maintain the significant amount or the required amount of liquidity needs that we may have. For example, each December now, we have to come up with the lump sum COLA payment of approximately $1 billion, regardless of what's going on in the world or in the markets. As it relates to the S&P 500, and you mentioned a couple of technology companies, great point, you're exactly right. But there's a lot of concentration risk, as it's referred to in the industry, in the S&P 500. And for PERS, we want to be mindful of that. And what we broadly are governed by is our strategic asset allocation, which is done based on an asset liability study every 5 years or so. And the current target allocation is around 59% public equities, 18 or 20% fixed income, 10% real estate, 10% private equity, 2% infrastructure, 2% private credit, and then the rest in cash or cash equivalents. So we're definitely, not only from really the board level all the way down to the fund managers, we're largely externally managed. We have an in-house investment staff that does a great job, and they're considering all those things you mentioned. And then the investment managers that are contracted with PERS, who serve as fiduciaries on our behalf, they are definitely considering all those things that you mentioned or alluded to. Last thing I'll say on the S&P compared to the PERS portfolio, definitely there'll be differences in short-term horizons, and there'll be differences, especially when things are up and things like you cited. But over the longer term, 25 or 30 years, we've averaged out closer to the S&P, not quite as much, but relatively close to it, with much less risk measured in terms of volatility. So hopefully that's helpful and responsive to some of your questions.
Thank you. I was just concerned because when you talk about real estate and all of that, it hadn't been booming. The market hadn't been booming. And I'm wondering, why haven't we concentrated more on the Mag 7 or something, even with defense and all of that, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, all of that, since we know that there's some tension out there. I'm wondering, I guess we are, and I know we have to do long term, but those
Sure.
are long term, and I'm wondering,
Sure.
I don't know how to state it correctly, but I'm wondering, can we make a few more adjustments to try to maximize this return so that we can get out of this hole?
Well, we definitely want to look at it. We want to do everything we can to maximize risk-adjusted returns. Just have to be mindful of the volatility because, say, for example, when some of those stocks may go down. So we just have to be mindful of that, but we certainly can continue to look at it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of questions following up on what Senator Sparks said. Mr. just want to make sure I understand, UAL, that's unfunded actuarial liabilities,
Accrued liability.
accrued liabilities, okay. And so what is our total liabilities based on the actuarial assumptions?
What is that exactly? 50, around 50 billion total.
50 billion, okay. So our assets are 38 billion, which I think, if I'm looking at this right, have gone up roughly 2.5 billion in the last 6 months.
Let me correct that. I think the total liabilities are around 60 billion, but go ahead with your question about that.
But then our assets have gone up roughly 2.5 billion over the last 6 months. Is that right? I see this
Sounds right.
June 30th to, okay. When we talk about liabilities, well, we talk about assets, that's a real number that we actually have.
Correct.
But now the liabilities is a guess.
Not a guess. I would say forecasted based on actuarial standards of practice, but it's definitely a projection or an estimate.
So you make assumptions.
Yeah.
Guesses on what we're going to get as a return on our investment. Is that accurate?
Well, I was actually referring to the liabilities, but we do something similar on the investment return with actuaries and investment consultants.
Right. So how do you build those liabilities?
Well, we'd be happy to have Mr. Coble come up and talk through that, but basically they take as far as the liability part, they're going to take and look at everybody's benefit and project out what the current and future expected liabilities are. And then you're going to discount it back to get a present value, and then you would compare that to the assets on hand. All right.
When we discount, we were using a 30-year discount period, and now we're using 25. Is that accurate?
I don't think that's accurate.
Explain the amortization period to me.
And if okay, Mr. Chairman, I'm gonna ask Ed to come up and talk to this. But the amortization period for the calculation of the ADEC, and the ADEC is the actuarial determined contribution. And according to the funding policy back in around 2017, the current unfunded at that time was to be amortized over 30 years, which is how you get to 2047, because this was around 2017. And then future gains and losses each year would be amortized with a 25-year period. And they combine that together to come up with the ADEC, which is what we've compared to the actual contribution and is based on what we recommended. Ed, if you want to come on up.
Okay. And then we came up with 7%. I guess that was a recommendation.
Yes, and I'm happy to, I want to talk a little more about the 7% when you finish up, but that is, and now if you'd like me to explain that now, I can. It definitely was a recommendation.
Okay. And how do you come up with that recommendation?
So there's a building block approach, is largely driven by and I'm gonna give a little history on this, driven by the actuary's recommendation. They take a building block approach with an inflation assumption plus a real rate of return assumption and get to the total assumed rate of 7%. They also consider the forward-looking capital market projections that are provided by our investment consultant to the board's investment consultant. In addition to that, the actuaries survey, they have information that gathers a survey of many other investment consulting firms, and they see what they are using, and all that is factored in for their recommendation. Now, if I could, I want to talk a little bit about the 7% if I can remember it all, because I don't know that this committee or this body has necessarily heard the rationale, because that was a few years ago when the board did it, and it was before the board meetings were streamed. And long story short, the board did that, one, serving in our fiduciary role, and they're serving in their fiduciary role, because it's very important that you have reasonable and appropriate assumptions. Otherwise, as I mentioned earlier, you can understate the liabilities and underfund the plan. But as far as the recommendations, what was the board, the experts, if you will, that they considered in adopting that, I recommended based on to the board that it go to 7% based on the following, and I'm gonna list out. One, our consulting actuary, based on 2 consecutive experience studies, had recommended 7%. Our actuarial auditor at the time, we have CAVMAC audited approximately over 5 years. The actuarial auditor had recommended lowering the assumption. The actuarial auditor before that had recommended lowering the assumption. The state essentially had recommended lowering the assumption. The peer committee in their report had commented on the assumption. The state auditor had commissioned a report, I believe, with Pew, who came back and recommended lowering the assumption. The legislature, by virtue of asking us to, or at least the House, it depends on the timing, develop a new tier, essentially ask for that because you have to make sure and price a new tier properly. Otherwise, you set yourself up for actuarial losses. Several other think tanks and policy organizations had commented on the assumed rate of return. The bond rating agencies had commented on the assumed rate of return. And I may be forgetting some, but as you can see, basically every analyst or expert that had looked at it had recommended lowering the assumed rate of return. And then and now, the 7%. Now, you don't want to do this just because of this. I just give it for context. You need to base it on the existing plan and state because every state's different. But the 7% then and now is around the median, looking at other public pension plans, and still slightly above average, if I remember right. And I think it's important, especially for a conservative state like Mississippi, which certainly, and I commend all of you and others for managing its debt and paying off its debt. That will help you do that sooner because it has more funding coming into the plan, and is overall positive. And I'll say this, even though we can't predict the future, and none of us can, I can say that at 7% as compared to 7.5%, the good years should be a little better and the bad years shouldn't be quite as bad. And the last 2 points I'll mention, one is, and you can find this in our reports on our websites, in the latest actuarial report, is that when you run the same numbers at 7.5%, the unfunded liability is still $23 billion and the ADEC is still 24%. So I say that just to illustrate that regardless, reasonable people can certainly disagree, and we look at this regularly and be glad to, but funding, additional funding is certainly the key. And so I thank you for the time to be able to give that background. I know it comes up from time to time. It comes up in different places from time to time, but I don't know that I've ever had a chance to give the background on what the board considered in making that change a few years ago. So thank you for that.
And when that changed, there were multiple other changes that also increased the unfunded liability. Is that accurate?
There's several, the mortality changes, and various other changes throughout the years.
Almost overnight, we had a significant increase in what was labeled as unfunded liabilities. Is that accurate?
Well, there was a big change, a noticeable change when the year that we went from 7.5 to 7. Now, what happened before that with the record return of almost 33%, I think it was FY21, the highest return to my knowledge on record with PERS, is we were able to go down from 7.75 to 7.55 without raising the rate. So the board and the system were trying to be aware and sympathetic of the cost of the state and the cost to employers. I don't think they get enough credit for that and being able to bring that down without the cost. So there was that, but then the 7.55 to 7, it was that was the year of the most noticeable change. It wasn't all assumed rate, but it was mostly assumed rate.
So on that, and being sympathetic to employers in the state, is there a calculation in the actuarial model that calculates if the employer rate increases and cities, counties, or the state hire fewer employees due to that increase, what effect that will have on PERS?
They do. One thing quick, the Reason Foundation on the assumed rate had recommended it lower. That's the one I think I might have left out. To your question, they do. They do look at the number of active members, number of retirees, and that ratio. They do a sensitivity analysis on the potential increases or decreases. It does have an impact. I will say this, it's definitely a factor, but it's not the only factor. And I would say from my own personal perspective, I'm starting to focus on that less because I think the funding and the investment returns and assumption changes probably have a larger impact. And I don't want people to get the misimpression to think that we can hire our way out of it, because I don't really think that's the case. So they do look at it. It is a factor. It's just not the only factor.
Okay. And then you had mentioned when you first began speaking today about lowering, say, the first responders' years to qualify for retirement. And you mentioned making sure that everybody pays the appropriate amount for that. But now, if I'm not mistaken, when the cost of, say, a Tier 5 employee would be around 11%, 12% maybe? Is that accurate?
No, sir, not the way I'm remembering it. We usually express that in the terms of normal cost, the cost of the benefit, not counting the unfunded. And I want to say it was 5.37 for Tier 5.
5.37, and the employee pays 9%.
That's true, but 5% of that is the DC. I was referring to the DB side, so.
And so 4% of theirs would go towards the covering that 5 point.
That's right.
And then, so then the employer is paying 19.9?
18.4 now, going up by law to 19.9.
19, okay. And 1.5% roughly is going to that employee's benefits, and the rest is going to the unfunded liability. Is that correct?
That's right. The remainder goes the
So
unfunded.
everybody's already covering, even if it goes up 1% or 2% on their retirement costs for that employee, they're already paying for that. It's just less that would be going to the unfunded liability. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah.
I think I understood you right. Yeah.
So as an employer in the state, hardly any of the money will be going towards that employee's benefit. It will almost all be going to the unfunded liability.
One of the things I like most about these presentations is all the public math. But to your point, the great majority goes toward the unfunded now and in that.
And right now, roughly 17% of when tier 5 gets going would go, and then it would be going up to 18.5% roughly. Is that right?
Roughly, I'd have to look at the letter, but I think so.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Senator. Senator England had a question.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Director Higgins, thank you for being here and for doing this presentation. I know we actually look forward to this every year. I don't understand everything that gets said, but, and my questions will probably reveal that to you. But my questions really come from some constituents' concerns. I represent a lot of people who are on PERS, and of course, they're concerned because this is their, this is their livelihood now. Is it, they're on a fixed income based on their retirement, so they're very concerned with what happens here. And I had the opportunity to attend a town hall in Ocean Springs. It was put together by the community there. It was very well attended. I hope my colleagues can do the same. A lot of times it may feel like a firing squad, but it's good for us to go listen to our constituents on this. And one of the things that was brought up at this town hall was a alternate tier 5 by the MRPEA, I believe. Are you familiar with that? That was put forward?
Generally, yes. Yeah.
Do you have any opinions on that, or is there anything that you can tell me about that plan and that you guys with PERS have looked at it and analyzed it, and do you have any thoughts on it?
Sure, I'll give you some information and background. Thank you for your question and your interest and support of PERS. And as you alluded to, it's certainly very important, not only to the membership of the entire state of Mississippi. And MRPEA and REPM and all the others, we appreciate their partnership. And I think all of us, even though we may not always agree on everything, and that includes the board and as a body as well, I think we all have shared goals, which is supporting PERS. As far as the one I think you're talking about, it goes back to an alternative that was discussed last year, and I'm going from memory somewhat here, but which, as I recall, was a 100% DB with a 1% guaranteed COLA, and I think that's probably what they're citing now, or maybe mentioned at your meeting. What I will say is in the year prior to that, the board had recommended a tier 5. Unfortunately, that one was not introduced in either chamber. But then I'm skipping over a lot, but fast forwarding to last year, the board endorsed the hybrid concept, or the hybrid plan. And during that time, when the plan that you mentioned was discussed, that part was not endorsed or voted on or supported by the board. As additional background, since it comes up, it continues to come up since you asked about it for some background. One thing I will share, I know certainly reasonable people can disagree. And as I mentioned earlier, it's ultimately the state's responsibility to design the plan. One of the things that I think is maybe happening in certain corners is that is being stated or said to be the same as the hybrid. And of course, I guess people can have different opinions on the definition of same. What I would share from memory, I'm looking at that back at that time, is I wouldn't say it's the same. I would say it may have had a similar projected funded ratio at a certain amount of time. For example, funded ratio in 2047 or 2055. I would say that it had a similar funded ratio, but I wouldn't say it's the same. And the reason for that, a few things. If I remember right on some of those charts, the unfunded would be paid off a few years later, but mainly the gap at a certain time was several $1 billion difference. Another key point that I would mention is the risk profile, who bears the risk. Because in a pure DB and in a DB plan, the system and the state bears the risk, whereas in the hybrid, it's shared with the employee. And then also comparing that plan, the alternative plan, if you will, to the current hybrid, when you project out under the alternative plan, if I remember right, the total benefits and therefore liabilities continue to increase, whereas the hybrid eventually levels off and starts to decrease. And I want to say, I think that's the majority of it. I feel like I'm forgetting one key point, but, so I wouldn't call them the same. They had a similar funded projection, funded ratio projection, but I wouldn't necessarily call them the same.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, and listen, I 100% agree that there's, reasonable minds can disagree on different plans. And I think you really hit the nail on the head when you said ultimately it's to the state to decide what we
Yeah.
do, and meaning the men and women in this room. And what's important to me with that statement is that the year before, we looked at a potential piece of legislation that would have changed the makeup of the board. And we heard from our constituents that that's not anything that they wanted to see. They wanted to keep the elected board. And we've done that, and the board has made their recommendation. Is that correct?
That's right. The board had recommended a tier 5 the year before and endorsed the concept last year.
Okay. The other question that I have, and again, this is directly from a constituent, and a lot of these folks and they're at that retirement age. They're dealing with a lot of different things hitting them, text messages and phone calls from different groups. And there's a lot of false information out there. I learned today that they are currently being asked for their updated phone numbers and emails. And I think that's to give to this group that is handling the defined contribution, the DC. Are you aware of that? Are y'all currently collecting information of PERS members? Can you explain, if you're aware of that, why you're doing that, and what the reason is for that information request, and why you may be sharing that, so that we can tell our constituents, hey, this is what the PERS board is doing?
Sure, happy to do that. If I could go back to the last thing, as I remembered the one extra point I want to mention, which is very important, going back to the alternative plan versus the hybrid. Also, if I remember right, the last year, when you look at that projected funding ratio in 30 years or so, it was similar. But if you ran it out another 10 years or further, that gap and that difference starts to widen. And that makes sense, because we've always said tier 5, no matter what method, is a long term. And if you think about it, they're not even hired yet. So 30 or 35 years from now, they retire. You got to get past that to when you start to see the gap widen. That's a key point. So I appreciate you letting me go back to that. So the question about emails, I think what you're referring to is the part of the tier 5 implementation. As mentioned earlier, the employee contribution will be 9%. 4% will go toward the DB, historical PERS. 5% will go for the DC account. And the law empowers the board to hire independent companies and third-party administrators and so forth. We recommended, the board approved Empower Retirement as the third-party administrator. They're also the TPA for the Mississippi Deferred Comp Program. And so the 4% money will come to PERS. The 5% will go to the DC provider. As far as part of that implementation, I'm just glossing over some of the high points. We are asking for certain information. And so we've been communicating with employers, not so much the board level. This is more staff and implementation, the law and the policy that the legislature's passed and the board has adopted through regulations and plan document. But we've been communicating with employers about what the information will be required. And some of that has to do with emails and phone numbers and marital status and all that. And to sum up, it was done for good business reason, to include communication, security, cybersecurity, tax implications, and things of that nature. So that's why we're doing it.
Okay, thank you. And I think that does explain it well. And I just would ask that, and I'm sure you're already doing all you can, but just make sure that the folks know, what their information is being requested for, who they are, and maybe even, explain, look, the word empower is obviously a very popular term for agencies and groups in Mississippi. And oddly enough, we have 2 empowers that school teachers are very much listening to. Okay, you've got this empower and you've got that empower, but you're talking about the group that is handling the defined contribution investment part.
That's right. We certainly can. That's Empower Retirement. They are one of the largest retirement service type administrators and providers in the country. I think they're headquartered in Denver. They, like I said, they've done the MDC program for us for several years. They do several other states. They do the hybrid for Tennessee to the north, but we certainly can communicate and try to put that part in there as well.
Okay. And the defined contribution, this is my last question, Mr. Chairman. The defined contribution is one thing that I've learned when I explain this to people at home, particularly younger employees or potential employees. The defined contribution is something that they pay into if they were to leave employment with the state, say after 5 years or less, is that a portion of their benefits that they can then roll over into a new plan? Because I do find that if we look at this generationally, it seems to me that the likelihood of new employees working 20 years, 25 years, 35 years at the same job, there just aren't as many people doing that. Is that something that was taken into account when coming up or when recommending this defined contribution hybrid plan that includes that to maybe help with some employee retention and recruitment?
Certainly considered, and I think the first part of your question is correct. DC contributions are 100% vested and they're portable, like you described.
Thank you. That was my last question.
All right. Thank you. Senator McMahon, you have a question? Oh, Senator Bryan, you have a question. Go ahead.
You said there are things about which reasonable people can differ. But we've been talking amongst ourselves over here. We think unreasonable people can differ too.
That's correct, yeah.
Just for the record. The Senate, first day of the session, second day, whatever, passed a bill which would allow some members of the system to continue to work and draw a benefit at the same time. I think you're familiar with that bill. Does the retirement system have any information for us about the impact that will have on the system?
Not at the moment. We are very much in the process of that and definitely will. The only thing in the interim we would just say is be mindful of that potential cost impact. And on the one that you talked about, like return to work or in-service distributions, certainly can have a cost impact. And we'll be providing that in the very near future. It's still a work in progress.
But it's my understanding that once again, the legislature passed legislation which will have a potentially a substantial impact on the system without getting information from the system about what that impact might be.
That's a fair statement with the quick.
I try to be fair.
Yeah.
Usually, when I can. I have a question about Tier 5. I've learned there's this term normal cost, which I think means how much it costs to pay the benefits for the people that are earning the benefit that day or whatever. But at any rate, if I'm an employee under Tier 5 and I'm contributing 9% of my income to the retirement system, it's being held out of my check, and my employer is putting in 17%. How much of that 17% will be going to pay for benefits of those who are in Tier 5?
If I understood you right, and I may ask Ed to confirm this or come back, but the great majority of that larger employer percentage is going to be going toward the unfunded liability of the past.
But isn't it the case that with Tier 5, if I'm an employee, I'm putting up 9% of my salary, and the contribution for the employer is pretty close to 2%?
Yeah, I think going back to that in your earlier question, I think was about 1.25 or 1.37. So that to your earlier question of the employer part going toward the normal cost is around 1.37.
So I'm an employer, I'm a city. I'm having 17% of my payroll go to the retirement system, but only 2% of that 17, if it's a new employee, is for the benefit of that employee. The other 15% is to pay off what I call the debt or the obligations that the system already has. And if I'm an employee looking at this new system, my employer's contribution to my retirement is 2%. And my contribution to my retirement's 9%. I got that right?
Generally and thematically. Now, one thing to keep in mind is the active members in Tier 4 also pay the great majority of their normal costs or their benefit as well and have for several years, just as background, but you're correct in what you were saying.
Well, and this is my final question, as they say, I feel like I'm on Jeopardy. If I'm a city and I'm a county or anybody else, I have a system where I'm paying a huge amount of money that's coming out of my payroll. And if I were to privatize anything or contract for anything, I would avoid that 17%. But the liability for those employees that I've got will continue to be there for the system. I think most multi-employer plans, or whatever you want to look at it, however you want to look at it, have some payment that someone makes when he's withdrawing from the system. And it seems to me that if I'm a city, and just take a hypothetical case, there's an obligation, future obligations for all my employees. And if somehow I privatize every single function of the city, then the next day, I'm no longer paying any money into the retirement system, but those same employees are still getting the benefit of what they've earned, and somebody somewhere is holding money out of current payroll to pay for that. Has the board looked at any method of having some sort of payment when someone privatizes something or withdraws from the system?
There has been some discussion about that in the meetings about some type of surcharge, if you will, maybe, or some type of payment associated with the outsourcing or with the contracting. I think there's maybe one bill, maybe some others this year. Now, partially related to what I think you're asking, one of the pieces of legislation that the board has recommended that I was alluding to earlier that we hope to bring forward is one that in the event an employer leaves the system for whatever reason, sale, dissolution, whatever the case may be, that they be required to pay their proportionate share of the net pension liability to the system. So that, in that respect, we've definitely looked at it. And there's also been some talk about the surcharge part.
Well, it just seems to me that if one is looking at long-term trends, the ability of people to move outside the system and avoid paying that 17% is such an enormous incentive that the way things are set up now, you're almost begging employers to do that. And of course, I think it's a terrible thing to have happen, but it seems to me that would be one of the first things I would do if I were trying to shore up the system long-term. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Bryan. Senator McMahon.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I want to sort of piggyback off Senator Sparks' comments. I appreciate Senator Sparks' work and his devotion to this issue and his service as a non-voting member over at the PERS board. He asked some very sophisticated questions and he understands in depth what's taking place. And I commend him on his work and leadership. My questions are going to be a little bit more elementary. And the reason for this is for the press and for anyone that is at home that may be watching this and having some questions. The legislature, the Mississippi legislature, in 1952 started the PERS retirement system. Would you agree with that, Director?
Yes.
So you would agree that the Mississippi legislature created the retirement program. And why would you speculate that we did that?
To provide benefits, long-term and retirement benefits to the members and the workers throughout state and local government.
There seems to be an idea that the Mississippi legislature is at odds with the retirement system, but you're stating for the record, the legislature created the retirement system for our employees. You would agree with that?
Yes, in law, in statute.
Okay. So was the system established to be self-funding?
No, sir. It was based on, is established to be essentially a pre-funded retirement system where contributions are paid in throughout the members' working time and then invested over the years, and then combination of the investment earnings and the contributions would pay the retirement benefits in their senior years or retirement years.
I'm going to allow you an opportunity to answer that question again in a different way. Was it created and envisioned to be self-funding?
I would say no. I don't quite understand.
Yes, it was created to be self-funding. Very little action had to be taken for the PERS retirement system to function correctly for many, many decades. Would you agree with that?
That's certainly before that, some of that's before I was born, let alone working here, so I can't quite do that, but I would think so.
Well, this goes to my point, you know, many of us are being left with a problem that was created 30 years ago. We're having to address something when a problem started 30 years ago. But it was created to be self-funding. The Tier 5 that was created, for our friends at home that might be watching, the general public, there is a PERS elected board that is elected by retirees and people in the PERS retirement system. You would agree with that?
That's right, eight out of 10.
Did the PERS board overwhelmingly send us an endorsed program by 8 of the 10 votes? Was it endorsed?
That's right. It was 8-1 with 1 abstention.
Did you agree? Do you endorse the program?
I recommended they endorse it at the time.
You recommended, as the director of PERS, the Tier 5 program.
That, yes, sir, that they endorsed that at the time, last December, I think it was.
And if the fund had not been losing $1 billion a year, we would not have taken any action. Will you agree with that?
I think it's fair that if not for the funding status of PERS and the rising contribution rates and things like that prompted the recommendation, discussion, and need for pension reform, i.e. a Tier 5. So I think that's, yes, I would say.
Okay. So this year, this body has voted on it's a Senate position under the leadership of Senator Sparks, Senator Harkins, and Senator Thompson. We're going to inject $1 billion into the program. Would you agree with that?
I hope so. The Senate's passed it for sure.
Yeah, that's the Senate position, that we're going to inject $1 billion to try to help the retirees of this state. It is not the first time this body has tried to act. In 2016, 2017, and 2018, it was also a Senate position. We placed money aside to put money into PERS before we funded anything else. It did not make it through the entire process, but we did have a bill in 2016, 2017, and 2018 to put forward funds because the legislature cares about the retirement system and we're committed to it. The legislature tries to work with the elected PERS board and take your recommendations, just as the board and you endorse the Tier 5. What other structural changes would you guys recommend to bring to us to make the fund even more solvent?
Well, I think at this year, we don't have any to recommend right now. This year, our focus is just on implementing Tier 5 primarily. We do have 3 bills that we're bringing forward. One has to do with ORP, the other one to do with MDC, and then one that has to do with the net pension liability I mentioned with talking to Senator Bryan. But recently, our focus has been on the pension reform of the Tier 5 aspect, and right now our priority is funding and implementing the Tier 5.
Well, I don't know if I completely agree with your answer, Director, because you just said it was a policy that y'all were asking us for more funding. That in itself is a policy, a request. So what other changes are y'all? There are small fundamental changes that could be made that have a big impact 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Would you agree with that?
Potentially, good.
When are y'all going to start bringing us some of those recommendations?
Well, we certainly could do that, and we will, but I will say this. I think-
When? We lost $1 billion last year. When are we going to see some additional recommendations? Because the taxpayers of this state, just to infuse cash year after year after year without other structural changes, when are we going to see some recommended changes by the board members who are elected to serve in the best interest of the retirement system?
Well, I hate to respond this way, but if I'm understanding things correct, I would say I'm not quite sure I understand where you say we lost $1 billion. We had 11.7 return last year in
2
investment.
years ago. 2 years
Last
ago.
year, we had 11.7.
Yeah.
The year before that was approximately 11%. And in fact, the investment returns have basically been toting the water on the contribution shortfall the last couple of years on what the legislature has not put in. So I don't quite follow all that. As far as recommendations, we recommended a tier 5 a couple years ago, and it was not introduced by either party in either chamber. Of course, we enjoy working with the legislature, want to continue doing that. I've always said that we should do that, work together, y'all as policymakers, us as fiduciaries, but I don't quite follow all of that. I also will say, I think 2 sessions ago, when we did recommend the tier 5 and phased into the contribution rate, there was a great deal of analysis that kind of goes in line, in my opinion, with the spirit of additional considerations, which dealt with something that had been written and publicized before in a historical state of the plan document, which gave what I'll call several contingency options of pausing and reducing and temporarily reducing and so forth, the cost of living adjustment. So I think historically the PERS system and the PERS board has been willing to be a resource and provided a great deal of information. Not that we necessarily recommend them, and we'll continue to do that. But one thing that's very important for you, everybody in this committee, everybody in both chambers to realize is at this point is PERS funding is very important. That's more in line with the actuarial recommendations because PERS is certainly stable, but it's important we work together to keep it that way. Going back to the earlier part of your conversation or question that I didn't quite follow, I can say something to maybe speak to that or to help with that in some regard about the self-funding. Over 30 years, the investment returns make up over half of the funding of PERS. And the employee contribution, basically less than a third come from the employer side or the taxpayer contribution. Over half is from investment earnings, another portion from the member earnings. So in that respect, that may have been what you're referring to. And I will certainly, now I follow where you were going, say that many of the challenges today that you are dealing with and that others are dealing with here have been building over decades, certainly been building over time. They've been building over decades with the unfunded growing, and it'll take some time to get through it. And we certainly appreciate the work of you and others on the funding aspect.
So, and I appreciate something you said there. Tier 5 was recommended 2 years in a row by the board in your office to this legislature, and we acted last year based on 2 years of recommendations for a tier 5 from your board.
For a top of tier, yes, sir. Yeah.
Okay,
All right.
perfect. And my final question, and thank you for answering my questions. And I know some of my questions have been elementary because I want people to fully understand where we are. Under the current tier 5 employee under the tier 5 employee that this legislature passed last year, in an effort to shore up longevity and sustainability of the retirement system, in your opinion, as the director, the new tier 5 employee with the 401k feature in many ways will have a more robust retirement than the tier 1 through 4 who do not have a 401k. Would you agree with that?
I think to some extent, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, but I will certainly say that the tier 5, I think, is a good benefit. It's a different benefit, but still a good benefit and has some pros and cons and has some advantages that the DB does not. Now, the DB is certainly a larger, stronger guaranteed benefit, but the DC has some, as you may have referred to as robust. It has the portability. It has the possibility for hardship withdrawals, things of that nature.
And one last comment. under the tier 5, let's say that we're a decade down the road and there's excess funds, a future legislature could bolt on additional benefits to that retirement system. Would you
Certainly.
agree with that?
Certainly, absolutely. And the tier 5 was also designed where the employers already have the option for optional and variable contributions. But yes, in the future, definitely.
All right. Thank you, Director, for answering my questions, and I hope it was helpful.
Sure. Thank you.
Senator Blunt for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Briefly, because I know it's getting on towards lunch and we appreciate you answering all our questions. We all care about this topic a lot. But I want to shift gears quickly to the bill that passed the House last week. A lot of people are focused on the education aspects of that bill, but I believe it brings forward all the important PERS code sections and makes changes to the PERS system. What is the analysis of whether House Bill 2 will increase or decrease the unfunded liability of the system, and what will its impact be on the system as a whole and future employees?
So we certainly think it will have an impact. Thank you for the question. That's still a work in progress. And on that, I want to just speak a little bit in general. We are reviewing all these bills. We have actuarial impact statements or reviews being conducted now. I know several of you have asked for several projections. It's about current legislation, House Bill 2, other potential legislation. We're doing those certainly as fast as we practically can, but it's important to do it well and get you good information. We should have that in the near future, if not this week, hopefully next week. So that's just to give a little update on, I know some of your requests and others. Back to House Bill 2, we're reviewing that. We don't have that as of yet. One of the reasons for that is we're seeking clarification with one aspect. As you mentioned, that's a very long bill that deals with a lot of other things. But there are several PERS provisions. From memory, I think it basically goes back to 30 years and age 60, and then it has some return to work provisions. And then it talks about changing how we calculate the average compensation. But our interpretation and understanding of the language in the bill does not necessarily match all the descriptions we've heard verbally. The wording, I think, talks about average compensation. The commentary has been about vesting, so we're seeking to clarify that and should have it. But we don't have an answer for you, but I suspect there will be a type of cost impact, and we're reviewing it and we'll get it to you as soon as we can, and others.
Thank you. I've certainly have made that request of you, and you've been very responsive, and I know that you'll be getting that to me before this committee and the full Senate has an opportunity to vote on it. But when the House voted on that bill last week, they did not have any information on the bill that they passed and what its impact would be on the retirement system, because you're still doing your analysis on that bill that has already passed the House.
That's correct. We're working on it now, subsequent to the passage.
Thank you.
Director Higgins, do you have a year-to-date, this fiscal year-to-date investment return?
Estimated at around 10%. Certainly hope that continues. Of course, today, this morning, I looked at the markets and they were earlier going in a different direction. It's hard to say, but estimated around 9 or 10%, and hope that continues.
Thank you. Senator Bryan, you had a follow-up question?
No, Mr. Chairman, I was just going to say, since so many remarks have been directed to people who may be watching, and since there was a discussion of how wonderful Tier 5 would be as opposed to the existing situation, I would encourage anyone, anywhere listening to this who is thinking about becoming an employee of the government or knows someone who's thinking about being an employee of the government, do everything in your power to get a job and get your membership started before March 1st. Because in my opinion, beginning in March 1st, if you're a government employee in Mississippi, you have no meaningful retirement system. If you want some meaningful retirement system, get a job before March 1st. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Sparks.
Just a couple of quick follow-ups based on some of the comments. Senator Bryan, Senator Blunt and I have the NPL bill, which we had last year, which the Senate passed. We also have the Roth catch-up provision. Senator Blunt and I both co-sponsored, of which we had last year and we both passed, the Senate passed. Those are both PERS recommended bills and continue to be PERS recommended bills. So we'll try to do that because I agree with you on the contracting around your obligation, but I would remind everyone, you should have a copy of this every time you talk to somebody that's a unit of government to show them their proportion of the debt. Because if you're contracting around, it doesn't matter. You still have your requisite proportion of the debt. And that's a good place for them to look. Second issue is the rate of return. And I know we went from 7.55 to 7 the same year we lost 8.34% in the market. So we took a huge hit to the liability on paper. But without beating a dead horse, the 7% is a major impact of the current funded status and the liabilities. And CAVMAC is also the actuary for the state of Alabama.
That's correct.
And they presented to us, and the state of Alabama's assumed rate of return is still 7.45%. So I want to be clear, the board makes those recommendations. The board makes those decisions. See, those aren't recommendations. Recommendations is send us more money. Decisions is we're going to lower the assumed rate of return and we're going to shorten the amortization period, and it's going to raise the liabilities. Therefore, the actuaries are then going to come back the next year and say, we need more money to hit this 2047 target. Now, I want to be fair to everybody in the process. That's all hard work. And I appreciate what they do, but there's a difference between making requests to stabilize a retirement system and misleading the public that $453 million is the only number that would pacify and satisfy PERS, because we've had all these major changes since then. But that is correct that Alabama's 7.45% based on their testimony to the House last year.
That's last I heard. Now,
All
I
right.
think they indicated it may be going down if they recommend going down or something, but that's correct.
They were going to stair step it so it wouldn't shock the liabilities, I believe, was their response.
I wouldn't disagree. I just
Okay.
sure.
And then finally, you mentioned the raising of the employer rate, because I made the comment, the legislature, for all of the wisdom I hear from former legislators around this state who comment how they would fix PERS, they didn't offer bills. They certainly didn't successfully pass them. And I won't say you corrected me, you said, well, actually the rate went up from 15.75 to 17.4 in 2014. And that's right. It's in this little booklet. Legislature didn't do that. The board did that. So I stand on my statement that from 2017, when actuaries did this 30-year calculation, presented to the board adopted the policy, legislature didn't do anything. But I can tell you what they did do, and this is Appendix M in your comprehensive program that you put on PERS. These are the PERS benefit modifications since 1985. If you want to see why we're $25 billion in the hole, I can show you. And you know who did do this? The legislature, the majority of it. Now, some of it the board may have done, but we raised benefits, which is politically so popular, and we let somebody else pay for it. They didn't put the money in to pay for these increases, and we made it retroactive. We went back in time to people that are already retired. So I say this to my friends in the retirement community, not only to the employees. My mom's retired, PERS employee. The changes we've made and infusions we've made of cash and the things we're going to continue to do is to pay the liability that we owe as the plan sponsor to these individuals. But if I'm a retiree and I belong to a retiree group and Tier 5 is going to pay my retirement liability off faster, I think you need to lead with that. Now, you can always say, I don't like a DC, or I wish it was all a defined benefit. But if I'm in a retirement group that doesn't see the letter from your actuaries in July of last year that shows the economic impact of the reforms we made to PERS and say, that makes my retirement more stable. It makes the payments secure. And that's the intent of this legislature. I would start with that, I believe, because they ultimately, just like Senator England said, this is their retirement. And we're trying to do our best to ensure it. Now, I don't get the glory of running around and doing what they did in 85 and 86 and 87 and 89 and 90 and 91. I just page after page, 92, 94, 99, 2000, 2001, 2002, plussed up benefits and didn't pay for them. That's why we have the liability. So I want to be fair. I wish I could be that guy. I wish I could be the guy that just adds benefits and doesn't pay for it. And we take this $1 billion and we spend it on our constituents, who would also be PERS people, on roads and bridges and schools and pay raises. But we got to pay the piper. And so it's what we're trying to do. And I appreciate your work, the board's work. We have anguished over this for the last 2 years to try to do what's right, but most of all, to do what the math says and stabilize the system. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one final note, because we talk about PERS from almost a business perspective in here, but when it comes down to it, the calls we get from constituents are generally people who are worried, will I get my retirement benefits? Or state employees that say, will PERS be around when I retire? And there's a lot of fear about that. And I think a lot of that is based on numbers being thrown out about, well, we're 56% funded, which I think based on the fiscal year end, June 30th of 2025, we were 56.7% in that funded ratio. But based on what you said today, with assets of 38 billion and roughly 60 billion in liabilities, that would put us at 63 to 64% funded. So we're headed in a positive direction, up roughly 7% maybe. At $2 billion per quarter point, the assumption going from 7.75% rate to 7% would knock those liabilities down to roughly 54 billion. And I think that would put us at over 70% funded. Is that accurate?
I'd rather not do quite that much math and,
Fair enough.
you know,
I can tell you that that's accurate. And so given the change in assumption, which went from 7.75 to 7, costing $6 billion on the liability side, when our 30-year average is 7.95, we could be 70% funded as of today. And I think that we need to be cautious in how we put out information about our funding ratio to where we give people a lack of confidence in their ability to receive their benefits. We have $38 billion in actual assets. The legislature, the PERS board, I assume you, all are working to make sure that retirees today and future retirees will get their retirement benefits as they have signed up for them. Is that accurate?
certainly, absolutely.
So I would challenge you to put out more information about how liabilities are made, and so that people don't look at a number like 56.7 when right now we could easily be at 70% funded just based on a decision by the board.
Well, the first part about communication, certainly, I don't know that I would affirm some of those parts on the percentages and the math, but I certainly appreciate the spirit and what you're saying and coming from, where you're coming from. We certainly can do that from a communication standpoint. Sensing that you all may want to finish up before too long, that's certainly up to the chairman and the committee. I'm going to refrain from talking a little bit about some of the details behind those numbers, like the actuarial smoothing and so on and so forth. We could always come back to that, and same thing about historical returns and all, and begin to, from my standpoint, wrap up on that, saying you make a good point about how I'll phrase is we got to remember the people behind the numbers. So PERS is certainly stable. As you mentioned, we have 38 billion in the portfolio. retirees and members can continue to count on PERS and their benefit. It's my belief that the legislature and the board and the system will work together to ensure that continues to be the case. And we got to remember that we talk a lot about liabilities, and I know I'm probably the worst one, and I did it a lot today, starting off with it probably. But we got to remember, as you know, in the context of PERS, the liability, that's somebody's promised benefit. That's that person at home that you're referring to, that we're all working together to make sure they get their benefit. And going back to some of Senator Sparks' comments, it's my understanding and belief that the reason the board endorsed the current Tier 5 proposal is because it was in the best interest in helping secure and continue the promised benefit of the existing members and retirees. So I think your point's well taken about the people at home being able to count on their retirement.
All right. Seeing no further questions or comments, thank you for taking the time. It was I think a fruitful discussion. We could probably reconvene at 2 and go till 5, but I know that's not what most people want to do, but I do appreciate you coming here and answering questions. And I think the more people, more times we dive in this, it just kind of uncovers several layers, and hopefully it will provide some food for thought for our members, our colleagues, and everyone in this building to think about as we move forward. Thank you for your time. If there are no further questions, motion to rise and report. All those
Thank
in
you.
favor
Thank
say
you.
aye. Opposed? The ayes have it.